What's good, hunters? Local Anglo CeraCymmetry holding the Gunners Guild hostage again for today. Thanks to everyone who's been enjoying this series so far, the response has been great. Bit of housekeeping before we start, there's now a playlist for our monster discussions, so you don't have to keep jumping between channels. In today's installment, it's going to be a little bit more speculative. You see, one of the big surprises of a recent SUNBREAK trailer was the return of the Thousand-Blade Wyvern, Seregios. Shockingly to no one, we were right yet again and predicted this.
Besides, where the hell are the people asking for Seregios back? I want him. Give me the pine cone.
Yeah, I mean, Steve can come back.
But I digress. Steve's back. So Phem and I will take you through the history of this guy, how it played, and what the previous games could tell us for his return in SUNBREAK. Seregios swooped into the scene as the flagship of the 4th gen's first Western release, Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Essentially billed as a rival to Rathalos, he was a fast, invasive species that specialised in omnidirectional attacks that looked and behaved completely differently to a traditional flying wyvern that we'd encountered up to this point. Side note, it's kinda hilarious that the next game Generations also gave us Astalos, another Rathalos rival. Poor little old timer can't catch a break, man. Seems to be a pattern going forward as Rathalos got bodied hard by Zenoga and Nargacuga in Iceborne, so much for Apex Predator, right?
The main gimmick with Seregios was the introduction of the bleed mechanic. Throughout the fight, this overgrown pinecone could throw out sharp blade scales that, if they struck you, would explode and build up the bleeding status ailment on the hunters. Once the threshold was met, usually in about 1 to 2 hits, you would be afflicted with bleeding. The blade scales he threw were very rough on new hunters. Hell, they're rough on everyone. See, if you got hit by one, that wouldn't be the end of it. It would also just explode where it landed and hit you again, and then again if he was enraged. So you were forced to move in rhythm or get caught in subsequent scale pops. And if you're unfamiliar with good old Steve, think Basil Goose, but the pinecones will target and stick to you before exploding.
Bleed was a status that caused damage every time you took an action. Swing your weapon, hurt. Sprint, you're bleeding. Roll, kill yourself. It was rough, and combined with the low impact Death of a Thousand Cuts battling style of Seregios, meant that damage would build up further and further. Before you knew what was happening, you were back at camp. The only way that hunters could cure this was to either use a mosswine jerky or cower in fear. Yeah. Crouching and staying completely still for about 5 or so seconds would cure the condition and increase your natural recovery for a small period of time. Staying still in the middle of a fight, as you can imagine, was a bit of a gamble, by which we mean it was nigh fucking impossible. Jerkies were definitely the way to go.
This status was extremely brutal if you were unprepared, as crouching to recover basically took you out of the fight entirely, and if you needed to roll to avoid a swing while you're crouched, well, you're just resetting your timer and taking more damage anyway.
Next up, let's take a look at some of the attacks. Seregios attacking sideways on brings an interesting sense of misdirection to the fight in a game where we were used to the monsters turning to face us before starting their next attacks. Steve was fluid, ending an attack facing away from you and being able to chain tail attacks from this state. Not only that, but a lot of plunging moves or aerial swoops would come from the side of the hunter, while Seregios was facing you to begin with. Steve always strafed around to your sides, kinda like Nargacuga, but it would strafe in the air and then onto the ground. Since its air game was also so strong, you never really knew where it was coming from. Really, the whole fight was a bit of a subversion of what we've come to expect from typical flying wyverns, such as Rathalos or Tigrex up to this point. The ability of Seregios to be more erratic in how it would attack you, rather than a simple flowchart of actions, sounds like a nightmare on paper, but it worked out incredibly well as a fast but still punishable fight. Now, a lot of this was due to the odd hit zone values it was given.
You see, typically most monsters have the head as a weak spot, which makes sense. You're dealing with the business end of a charge, a roar, or even a fire breath, so it's risky to get close to it. And it'll always end up facing your way eventually, right? Yeah, well, Seregios turned that around. See, in 4U, the head had a measly 32 for cut and 35 for blunt hit zones. Even in GU, where weakness exploits started to dominate, cutting weapons still couldn't get the 45 hit zone value required to make the skill pop. No, Seregios' squishy parts weren't on the face, they're actually underneath it.
The legs and the stomach, both having hit zones of 45 and up, would be your focus point, and this meshed perfectly with the fighting style of the thing. Remember how we said he was a rabid and aggressive fight, always staying on top of you? That worked out in the hunter's favour here. You see, since a lot of the smaller scrapes and head swings didn't inflict major knockback to hunters, provided you could dodge in and out of a bleed proc, you were laughing. The legs and stomach were 2 hit zones that were so readily available to you, no matter where you swung underneath him, you'd always end up connecting for some decent damage. Not only that, but Steve had a lovely stagger point on his legs. build up enough damage, and he'd trip for some time. In 4U, it was comical, as this threshold was so low, you could chain trips very easily for some huge damage, and this was one of the main downsides of the monster. Sometimes it can get trivialized with enough knowledge. Even Apex Seregios still had his exploitable zones on the legs during the Apex state, so you don't really need the Y-Stones to deal with him, unlike other Apex monsters. Nevertheless, it was still a good fight, and the accessibility of the hit zones did mesh well with the fighting style of the monsters. It's just in 4U it was a little bit too weak. GU on the other hand sent Seregios straight to the gym for 3 whole years of leg day. Whilst you would still be doing some decent damage to the same hit zones, the stagger thresholds was skyrocketed, and the dude barely tripped.
This made Steve in Generations much scarier, and especially Hyper Steve, because you needed to damage the leg still, but the topples were much more infrequent, so he had a lot more uptime, and we all know topples only lasted like 3 seconds in older generations anyway. And his face was still required to be broken, as breaking the sword horn on his face was the only way to reduce the blight of the sword scales, because once it was broken, the scales would only pop once and therefore be much safer and bleed less frequently. So you had the choice of a weaker hit zone on the face to stop the punishment, or a better hit zone on the legs to eventually get the trip, but either way, I mean, it was a rough fight.
Nevertheless, despite its flaws, this synergy of a hyper-aggressive monster that's always on top of you, and the non-conventional hit zones that are always presented to you as the hunter, was a brilliant bit of design by Capcom here, and God only knows what would have happened if they put the main weak point on the head or, let's say, the wings. So with that, onto the gear itself. What's your reward for taking down the guy? Let's start with 4 Ultimate. The armor came with the skills Mind's Eye / Razor Sharp. Now these were both on a combination skill called Edgelord. Combo skills were a pretty interesting concept, but that'll be for another time and another video. Constitution 2. This reduces stamina consumption from evades. Oh, and back then it allows you to panic dive whilst facing the monster. Bleeding resistance. This one's quite ironic. Seregios was literally the only monster in 4U that did bleed damage. The only one. I mean, crit boost too, right? Clearly this was the best skill in the entire game.
Gunner armor in 4U was fairly decent as well, boasting high slot count, the recoil skill, and normal up. While obviously not the best, it was still an excellent set to start up as a gunner in early G rank. Now in GU though, Edgelord was swapped out for critical draw, which wasn't too bad, and gunners got Deadeye, which is the older version of ballistics. But then we got a new toy to play with.
In GU, the skill Blade Scale Hone was added. This gave Blade Masters the ability to recover 5 units of sharpness after approximately 5 rolls, and gunner weapons reloaded a bullet after every single roll. Bows strangely gave a power boost to close range coatings, meaning they functioned as additional power coatings. Now this all seems a bit odd and very arbitrary, until you look at the weapons. The Steve weapons were admirable. Small natural purple, decent white for the Blade Masters, with about 10% natural affinity. They sat at around 290 to 300 true raw, and most of them had a slot at least. Pretty huge stats right there. Now the gunner weapons had average clip sizes for spread and pierce, the same sort of amount of raw, and a focus on slicing shots, which is pretty appropriate. Then there was the bow. Around 20 to 30 more raw on the Canvas edition with a focus on rapid shots. This bow was insane, and to be honest, all of the weapons were pretty respectable. Pretty decent stats. I mean, if you consider the Blade Master weapons and the bow guns, the only real downside is, respectively, small sharpness segments and clip sizes, right? Or was it? You see, the Steve weapons had a gimmick, in that the aforementioned Blade Scale Hone was naturally on the weapons. That's right, Lunastra, eat your heart out, Seregios did it first. Imagine making a weapon a Blade Master weapon with built-in sharpness management, or a gun that would reload a shot whenever you rolled.
Which was amazing for heavy bowguns, as it allowed for a more mobile playstyle, as soloing Apex monsters with Siege was a little rough in 4U. And then the bow added damage boost to the close range coatings, meaning that they essentially function as bonus power coats. It's great for resource management as a bow, because in the older days it wasn't the god tier weapon it is now, and it needed all the extra power coats it could get. But this also made Seregios' bow one of the only viable bows in 4U outside of some god rolled relic bows. 40 extra power coats was too good to pass up.
Now onto the main point of this video. As we've seen, Seregios is returning in SUNBREAK, and that's great. He hasn't been around for quite some time, so it's good to see this pinecone show up again. If ever there was a monster that could challenge the mobility and speed of hunters right now, it would be him. From a couple of clips in the trailer, we can see that he combos his tail swipes into spinning moves that throw scales, and if the hunters get pinned by him, there's going to be a very swift follow-up. Not only that, but we can see he's doubling up on some of the claw dives that we're used to. All of this points towards a much more aggressive, much more rabid Seregios.
Additionally, as mentioned before, The speed of the thing is going to give hunters a run for their money. We've spoken before about the speed and lack of consequences we have now with, the wire bug mobility, wire fall, no knockback guards, shoulder tackles, you name it. Like 5th gen's got a lot of stuff. Hopefully SUNBREAK will be pulling out all the stops with the various silk mines and options that we have now, and I have a feeling and hope it will feel like we're just finally leveling the playing field rather than ascending above it as we've seen before, because this thing is still crazy even by the trailers. Like, we've only seen it for a few clips. It is fast. Plus, it looks like they removed the follow-up explosions on the throne scales, which means that trading is going to be a bit more dangerous and bleeding status is going to be way more prevalent than it has ever been in 4th gen. Especially when you consider that monsters like Nargacuga, who've gained bleed thanks to Steve, now cause it by leaving their spikes on the ground for hunters to step on. I wonder if Steve's gonna now fill the field of blade scale caltrops like Basilgoose does with his pine cones. And the only thing that would be a real ball buster for Seregios is if Capcom went ahead and changed all his hit zones and made it like any other monster where you just need to bop his dome and cause the head topples and then the sword break all at the same time.
Now, gear-wise, what are we looking at for SUNBREAK? Well, the weapons, if they go by previous options, are going to be great. Back in 4U, they were great for progression, getting natural purple sharpness in their first G rank upgrade, as well as some of the best raw until around about later G2. Translating this to the current state of Rise bodes incredibly well, with crit stacking for Master's Touch being more difficult, and Handicraft being an incredibly expensive skill, having additional sharpness management will be very, very welcome. Additionally, larger slots have more weight to them now, with important skills like Evasion, Guard, now Attack and Crit Eye taking up larger and larger spaces. So all in all, if the Steve Blademaster weapons are true to their ancestors, we'll be looking at some very solid options not just for story progression, but for endgame as well.
The gunner weapons, on the other hand, end up being straight up busted if they're going to continue with the same sort of mechanics from Rise. Remember that Steve's light bowgun could rapid fire slice in 4U and had slice 1 and 2 in Generations, and we all know how slice is in Rise. If the bowguns retain their affinity for slicing ammo as they had in the past, then a full volley of slicing may end up being just some of the most crazy damage you can dish out. Think about siege slice ammo for heavy bowgun, that would be insane. Of course, we may see various nerfs, but that's all kind of assumed with all the weapon classes at this stage. The bow having historically higher raw and a penchant for rapid arrows and the coating boost, combined with the bow class being one of, if not the most powerful weapon in the game, means that end-rank G monsters are just gonna melt if we don't see some sort of nerf.
Of course, there's no real way of knowing how things will turn out for sure, but at least we have historical evidence for stats we can look back over, rather than just boundless speculation. So, in SUNBREAK, how about the armor then? Gonna say it, God, please give us something different. If there's any way that the armor continues with the previous skills, there's not really going to be too much to stay relevant for Blade Masters. Constitution, yeah, that's okay for dual blades. Critical draw's kind of a bit useless now, and bleeding res is really one of those skills that you'd only really gem in, to be honest, even if it does end up applying to a wide range of monsters.
Now gunner-wise, however, came with the skill normal up, so in the current meta, a set with decent slots, constitution, and normal wrap up is going to be a bow user's wet dream. Having two basically required skills, with one of them being a level 3 gem naturally on the armor, saves a lot of skill tax and can really open things up for a lot of players.
Of course, disgusting meta players only focus on relevant skills, literally ruining the game, blah 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 blah, whatever. Point is, this is what Phem and I care about, this is what's relevant to us, and this is the stuff we like to talk about and analyse. And I think it's something that you might find interesting if you give it a look. Now, from the history in previous games, as I said, it seems like the Steve armor is going to be best suited for gunners, and unless they shimmy around some of the sharpness skills, swap Mind's Eye for Razor, maybe something like that, or even add in Handicraft, not much else. The weapons on the other hand go hard. A good, dependable raw option with large slots, great sharpness management is going to be something that will be very widely appreciated. I mean, if you consider Nargacuga's weapons, they're favoured for their high base sharpness and affinity right now, and they've got respectable raw. It means that hunters can focus a bit more on sharpness management and raw with powerful sets. Seregios seems to go the same way, but it trades off some of that affinity for more sharpness management, a bit more raw again, and again could be a good alternative to this Nargacuga dominance come endgame. But really, that about wraps it up for the summary of what we can expect from Seregios and what's happened in previous games. Please don't screw it up, Capcom. This guy's very underrated and deserves all the praise he can get.
And can we get like a Steve Easter egg or something in the quest descriptions, please? That'd be fun.
Thanks for watching this series as always, lads. You always have a lot of stuff to say in the comments. Really appreciate it. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and we'll catch you next time.